Hello and welcome back to our fourth lesson in Unit 1 on the birth of the New Testament. This time we will be talking about the resurrection experience that the disciples had. Before we do that though, I want to consider the nature of extraordinary or maybe religious experiences and how people react to those. For a moment that you're just walking along the wilderness and minding your own business, and as you're walking along, all of a sudden you see a small bush and it's on fire. Now what would you do? I would probably call 911 and get the fire department. But then as you are waiting, you're checking it out closer and you see that there is fire, but it's not consuming anything. That bush is still there, it's not disappearing. And you're curious, you might want to step a little bit closer, but then all of a sudden, as you're stepping closer, there is a voice. And the voice would tell me, Clemens, Clemens. You're looking around and saying, where does this voice come from? What's happening? I might get a little bit afraid. Then the voice says again, Clemens, Clemens. What would you do? Would you answer? Or would you run away? I don't know. I might want to run away, but I think I may also want to say, yes? Who is calling? And the voice would say, I am your God. And I would answer, who are you? What is your name? And the voice says, I am who I am. And then the voice will give you a job to do that is your specific mission to accomplish. Well, that's exactly what happened to Moses. You might have recognized the story already, right? You can get into the link here to see the story of Moses in Exodus 3 a little bit closer. But that's what happened to Moses. And he was certainly scared. He was curious. He was stunned. And then after the completion of it, he ran back to his tents and he told his wife Zipporah about what happened. And from then on, his life changed. And he went to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go. So, and now I'm out here in the wilderness where we meet Elijah the prophet. You can read a lot about him in the first book of Kings. There are lots of stories about Elijah. And as we meet him, he has just won a big contest. All of the prophets of Baal. He was living at the same time as Ahab, the king, who was married to Jezebel. And Jezebel was a foreigner. And so she brought in the worship of Baal. And Elijah had just won against all those Baal prophets. But now Jezebel was after his life. And therefore, he was now running away and he was hiding himself. He was laying down and he wanted to die. Here's Elijah. He's ready to die. He's all depressed right now. When an angel comes and is giving him some extra food. He picks up the food and sits up and eats a little bit. But this didn't help too much yet. After eating, it's just going to go right back down and sleeps a little bit longer. When the angel comes a second time and gives him food again, this time sits up and he eats. And then he gets up and goes on his journey to the bottom of Mount Horeb. And Elijah is climbing up Mount Horeb, hoping to meet God. Up on the mountain, Elijah is hovering in the cave, expecting to meet God. But there was a strong wind, a very strong wind. But God was not in the wind. Elijah is going back into into his cave and an earthquake comes. But God is not in the earthquake. And then fire comes by. But God is not in the fire. But then Elijah steps out of his cave. So even though Elijah had done many things already on behalf of God, he met God for the first time, and to his surprise, it was not in the wind, it was not in the earthquake, it was not in the fire, but it was in the sound of sheer silence. Yes, God must have spoken to his heart. And with that surprising encounter, Elijah too has a new mission and a new start. Now let us meet again the prophet Isaiah. Remember, you have met him when we talked about the messianic pronunciation that we read in Isaiah 9. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, so forth, and announced the coming of the Messiah, the anointed. What Isaiah really was originally, he was a priest, and he worked in the temple in Jerusalem. And in that, as he was conducting his normal job, he had an encounter with God that changed his life, and that ripped him out from his normal task as a priest so that he became a prophet. And so we are encountering him in the temple as he performed his duty as the high priest that year. What you also need to remember is that back then people believed that if they encountered God directly in person, that would mean that they would have to die. And so now let's come in here to meet Isaiah when he's being called as the prophet. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in the attendance above him. Each had 6 wings, and 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another, saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots of the threshold shook at the voice and those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I have among the people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the King of the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, keep listening but do not comprehend, keep looking but do not understand. And so it continues with the voice of God. And Isaiah has been sent as a prophet. Imagine how scary that must have been for Isaiah to encounter God in the temple all by himself with angels around and everything. It was a sacred space. And then to encounter God, that changed his life. Of course, he continued to be the priest at the temple in Jerusalem, but he had a special function to go and confront King Ahaz on a regular basis with the things that he was doing wrong. And so the encounter of God was a frightening event, a scary event, and yet he was courageous enough to say, Here I am, Lord, send me. And it changed his life. And he did what was not easy, to speak truth to power. And so with that, let us go to see the resurrection experience that the disciples had. I'm starting this video walking through this beautiful old cemetery in Ridgefield. Jesus' death on the cross could have meant the end of the movement. Everybody left, was afraid, and was disappointed. But then we have the reports that people saw Jesus again.
Behind him came Simon Peter, and he went straight into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the cloth which had been around Jesus' head. It was not lying with the linen cloths, but was rolled up by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in. He saw and believed. They still did not understand the scripture which said that he must rise from death. Then the disciples went back home. Mary stood crying outside the tomb. While she was still crying, she bent over and looked in the tomb. And saw two angels there, dressed in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head, the other at the feet. "Woman, why are you crying?" they asked her.
"They have taken my Lord away, and I do not know where they have put him."
Then she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not know that it was Jesus.
"Woman, why are you crying? Who was it that you were looking for?"
She thought he was the gardener, so she said to him,
"If you took him away, sir, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him."
"Mary." She turned toward him and said in Hebrew,
"Rabboni."
This means teacher.
"Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet gone back up to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to him who is my Father and their Father, my God and their God."
And then Jesus appeared to many of the other followers. And they started to be excited that maybe this is not the end. After Jesus has appeared many times over 40 days to his followers, they were inspired to continue the mission. And we have the story of Pentecost in the second chapter of Acts, where the Holy Spirit came upon the disciples and they preached about Jesus and that he is alive, and a great many people were added to the number of believers. Hearing about the formation of the new movement, the Jerusalem church. We hear that they are still going to the temple to worship in the temple, that they're reading the Torah, they're keeping the Sabbath, and that on Sundays they gather in their homes to tell the stories about Jesus and to celebrate the resurrection on the day after the Sabbath. We also hear that they all sold their goods and came to live in a communal living. It sounds a little bit like the Essenes, who lived in poverty and gave everything up to live in community. When people asked how they could join this community, they were told that they needed to be baptized. And so we hear that a great many people were baptized and were added to the number of the believers in Jerusalem. They even started to grow so fast that they had a problem. At some point, people complained that the apostles weren't taking care of everybody, especially the widows. And so they came up with new solutions. They elected deacons, one of whom was Stephen. But the great success of the early believers, there was also jealousy and anger among the Pharisees especially. And so we hear that one day Stephen, as he is preaching, he is being hauled in front of the Sanhedrin also, just like Jesus. And he is being judged to deserve death. They're taking him out of town and they're beginning to stone him. I have a little note here that on the sidelines is a young Pharisee by the name of Saul, who is pleased to watch the stoning and death of Stephen. The apostles continue to be the leaders in Jerusalem, but we should still call them a movement that Jesus had started within Judaism. They really don't understand themselves to be anything but Jewish yet. Remember, they don't have a New Testament. There is no Christian Bible. They only have the Old Testament. They have really no idea what it means to be anything but Jewish. They continue to practice the Jewish law. They keep kosher. They are practicing circumcision. They are keeping the Sabbath. And in the midst of this, they're telling the stories of Jesus, so that they are understanding themselves to be a Jewish movement following their rabbi Jesus. But all of that is soon to end. After describing the early believers in Jerusalem, the book of Acts shifts the story to this young man who was standing by watching the killing of Stephen, to Saul. Saul was an educated man. He was born in Tarsus in Asia Minor in the year 5 CE. He was well versed in Greek culture and Greek philosophy. His father was Greek and a Roman citizen, but his mother was Jewish, and that made Paul Jewish. So his parents sent him to Jerusalem when he was a young man to study Judaism. He went to the school of the Pharisees and became a super duper 150% Pharisee. As a Pharisee, he knew about the Jesus movement. He thought it was terrible that these people existed, and he made it his life mission to find them, to drag them in front of the Sanhedrin, and to sentence them and to put an end to this movement. And so one day he asked the Sanhedrin for a letter to find some of those early Jesus movement people in the town of Damascus. And he makes his way to Damascus. As Saul is on his way to Damascus, he has an encounter with Jesus. We can hear about this in 5 places in the Bible, 3 times in the book of Acts as accounted by Luke, and 2 times by himself in the letter to the Galatians and in 1 Corinthians. As he was walking along the road, suddenly he was struck by a bright light. He fell to his knees, and he is having an appearance of Jesus, who says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" You might want to cut away here to see the video that shows his encounter more dramatically. After this encounter, Paul finds himself blind. His companions are picking him up and are taking him to Damascus, to Ananias, who after 3 days lays his hands on him and his eyes are opened again. And from that moment on, Saul had a conversion. He is now, as much as he was persecuting the Jesus movement, he now became 150% supporter of the mission of Jesus. So in conclusion, we heard 3 stories from the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, and several stories from the New Testament where God encountered people and that encounter changed their life. Usually when people encounter God first, there is a moment of being afraid, being scared, not knowing what exactly was going on, maybe curiosity as in Moses' situation. But in each and every case, it changed the people's lives. And they then pursued, based on their encounter with God, a new life and a new mission. Now it's important to see that all of that is always a motivation of belief, right? None of these encounters and none of these stories can actually be proven. It is something that each person has experienced in their own life, in their own heart. And that has changed their outlook. And all we can go by is by their witness and what they have witnessed and testified to their situation. Maybe you have had a life-changing experience also. And maybe you cannot really prove it to anybody else outside, but you know for yourself that it was life-changing. And so we can look at the Bible, pretty much the whole thing, even though it has historical context and historical background, which we want to study and learn about, but ultimately it's a document of faith. And that is the power of the Christian scriptures. That is the power of a religious writing. That is the power of the Bible.